So the opportunity now for people like me and Dr. Afrasiabi is to think about what these discussions might be about. I think you can have a lot of finger pointing. The U.S. has a whole list of actions by Iran and Iran's friends in Hezbollah and Hamas, and there are many accusations the U.S. could place. But if we could, for the moment, put all that aside and think about what our two countries would want to sit down and talk about if this process of diplomacy could flower, I think that would be a useful exercise.
All right, before going to Dr. Afrasiabi,
if I may reply.
Yes, go ahead. But there's one word, Dr. Afrasiabi, and that is the question of diplomacy. All right, just go ahead. I mean, I would like to hear David's definition of that before coming to you, but let's hear what you had to say. Dr. Afrasiabi, go ahead.
Well, while I completely concur with what Mr. Ignatius just said, however, I'm a little disconcerted by these contradictory signals from Washington that indicate that whereas President Obama in his April New Year message to Iran assured the Iranians that he will not advance negotiations with threats, we see today that the exact opposite is about to happen, or is starting to happen. And we have reports that President Obama has requested an updated and refreshed military plan for military strikes against Iran, and the military option is being rejuvenated. And even Mr. Ignatius in his piece referred to a few minutes ago endorses that. So that, I think, pollutes the environment instead of letting it flower and blossom. And it's a counterproductive measure because it really closes the space for diplomacy, gives diplomacy a very unattractive, coercive nature or flavor, and is repugnant in the eyes of the Iranians, and it's simply not a good move on US's part to retract and so forth.
Let me read from David's piece what he means by diplomacy. Here's what he says. But we have to be frank. The quiet, deniable covert activities undertaken so far have not stopped the Iranian program, and they are not likely to do so in the future. There is no magic bullet. The best hope of stopping Iran from making a bomb is diplomacy, and here's the definition: backed by the threat of tough sanctions, backed by the ultimate threat of overt military power. So, David, what kind of signal is this sending to the Iranians? Do you think this sounds like diplomacy to the Iranians? All right, I guess we just lost David for a second. But Dr. Afrasiabi, back to you. Here is when I mentioned the word diplomacy. When you talk to the Iranian officials, people on the street, diplomacy perhaps sounds different. They say, all right, diplomacy means, well, let's sit down and talk. But here is the Obama administration's version of diplomacy simply at a barrel hut. Do you think that is going to work? And first, is that diplomacy?
Well, diplomacy is the art of the possible, and in order to make it work, you have to create the right environment for it, not by sending mixed signals or contradictory, counterproductive signals that take away the other side's confidence that you're going to engage in diplomacy in good faith. And, the idea of tough sanctions and military options as a conducive or backer for diplomacy has already been questioned by Iranian officials and leaders, including former President Rafsanjani, who in a Friday prayer a couple of weeks ago said that that is like the old language, and that doesn't work with Iran. And I think that people in Washington need to listen to that and bracket this kind of coercive language and adopt a new style of diplomacy with Iran, which would be persuasive and based on mutual respect in order to gain some tangible results from it. I hasten to add that there's no evidence of any military diversion. Iran is exercising its legal rights under the Articles of Non-Proliferation, and the IAEA has repeatedly confirmed that it has full surveillance of Iran's enrichment facilities, and they remain in peaceful use. All the outstanding questions have been resolved in Iran's favor, and that raises the question of legality of the sanctions on Iran, because the standards have to be really tough and high for the United Nations or any part of the international community to try to deprive a nation of a sovereign right, in this case Iran's right to possess peaceful nuclear technology, nuclear fuel cycle, enjoyed by so many other nations such as South Korea, Brazil, and Japan. So, we need to remain within the legal framework and consider the fact that Iran has partially complied with the UN resolutions on Iran that has called for increased cooperation between Iran and the IAEA, which, as I said a minute ago, have borne fruit, and all the outstanding questions which were the primary reasons for dispatching Iran's nuclear dossier to the UN Security Councils have been resolved in Iran's favor.
All right, back to David. We lost you. Our apologies to you and our viewers for technical problems. But did you hear the question, David? Back.
Let me go back to the question that you put to me a moment ago, which is very important, which is what do we mean by diplomacy? And let me describe my own view of this. It reflects conversations with officials in this administration, the previous one, and the foreign policy community generally in the United States. My model is what Dr. Henry Kissinger did with China in the beginning of U.S. engagement with China in 1971. What Dr. Kissinger did was talk on a broad basis about China's interests and America's interests. And he looked to identify the areas where those interests coincided, were very similar. With the U.S. and Iran, we can see before we even start that we have similar interests in Iraq. We both support the current government in Iraq of Prime Minister Maliki. We'd like that government to succeed. We have similar interests in Afghanistan. We'd like a stable government there. We've cooperated in the past in reducing the influence of the Taliban. So there's a second area. A third area where we have similar interests is Pakistan. Iran, like the United States, would not like to see a Salafist, jihadi government take control in Islamabad, changing the map in the region. So we start with three areas where we have common interests, just as the United States and China began in 1971 with a shared interest in containing the Soviet Union. There are areas where we obviously disagree, and the nuclear program is probably the most important. And in that discussion, there's going to have to be real dialogue. Iran is going to have to listen to the arguments that the United States makes and is backed by the UN Security Council and 4 resolutions by the Security Council, raising questions about the Iranian nuclear program. Iran somehow is going to have to assure not just the United States but the whole world that this program in fact has only a peaceful civilian intent. But if that dialogue can reach all those issues, that's the kind of diplomacy that changes the world. And that's what I think on both sides we should be thinking about in this period. Not small accusations back and forth, but these fundamental issues of our interests and your interests. And as President Obama said, interests and mutual respect. We have to show Iran that we respect you as a country. You have to show us that you respect us as a country. If we can do that, the world's going to be different.
Dr. Afrasiabi.
Well, I agree with everything that Mr. Ignatius just said. I'd like to add that we cannot impose arbitrary red lines on Iran's nuclear program and force Iran to forfeit its right simply because of unfounded accusations that are not backed by empirical evidence. There is no sign of any smoking gun, no sign of diversion to military purposes. And all of Iran's nuclear facilities remain under the IAEA's inspection and surveillance regime. And the IAEA is easily able to detect any diversion as a result. So because of those, let's bear in mind what President Obama said in Prague back in May, saying that the U.S. is willing to acknowledge or recognize Iran's nuclear rights as long as they're under rigorous IAEA inspections.